Back to Mr. Hunter's book reading, The People of Sparks. This is chapter 4.5, the half chapter between 4 and 5, titled The First Town Meeting. While Lena slept, the 3 town leaders were holding a meeting. They sat at a table in the tower room of the town hall, which looked out over the plaza. Mary's hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Ben scowled, his gray eyebrows bunched together, deepening the 2 lines between them. Wilmer pulled nervously on one ear and looked from Mary to Ben and back to Mary. "They can't stay here," said Mary. "There are too many of them. Where would we put them? How would we feed them?" "Yes," said Wilmer. "But where can they go?" No one spoke. They had no answers for that question. Outside the settlement of Sparks, the empty land stretched for miles in all directions. "They could go up to Pine Gap," said Wilmer. "Maybe." Mary snorted and shook her head. "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "That's at least 2 weeks' walk away. How could these feeble people travel that far? How could they carry enough food with them? Where would they get enough food unless we emptied our storehouse and gave them everything?" Wilmer nodded, knowing she was right. The people of Sparks knew of only 3 other settlements, and they heard from the roamers that those places were smaller and poorer than Sparks. Their inhabitants wouldn't want extra mouths to feed either. The 3 of them gazed out the window and down at the moonlit plaza, filled with strange, sleeping people from a city under the earth. 400 of them, with no food, no possessions to speak of, and nowhere to go. "What I fail to understand," said Ben, "is why this particular misfortune has happened to us." He paused, looked into the air to his left and frowned. This was a habit of his. He seemed to need a pause and a frown every now and then to put together his thoughts. Wilmer and Mary had gotten used to wading through those pauses. "I don't see that we deserve it," Ben went on for a few seconds. "Having labored as diligently as we have, and just when we are starting to prosper at last, after so many years of, well, adversity is a mild word for it." The others nodded, thinking of the hard years. There'd been winters when people shivered in tents and ate chopped-up roots. There had been years of drought and plagues of tomato worms and devastating crop failures that meant people had nothing to eat for months but cabbage and potatoes. There had been times when people had to work so hard to stay alive that they sometimes died just from being too tired to go on. No one wanted to go back to those times. "So what do we do?" said Mary. "If they can't stay and they can't go, what is the right thing to do?" The others sat silent. "Well, there's the Pioneer," said Wilmer, "as a temporary solution." "True," said Ben. "Good thought," said Mary, and Wilmer beamed. "So what about this?" Mary went on. "We'll let them stay in the Pioneer. We'll give them water and food. We do have some extra in the storehouse. In exchange, they work. They help in the fields. They help with the building. They do whatever there is to do. We'd have to teach them how. As far as I can see, they know nothing. After a while, they'll be stronger. And when they know better and how to get along, they can move on. They can set up their own village somewhere else. We'll have to watch them carefully if we let them stay," said Ben. "They're strange. We don't know what they might do." "They seem fairly ordinary to me," said Mary. "Except for the business about living in a cave." "You believe that?" said Ben. Mary shrugged. "The question is, shall we let them stay?" "How long would we have to keep them?" asked Wilmer, "before they were ready to go?" "I don't know. Maybe 6 months? Let's see. It's near the end of the flowering." Mary counted out the months on her fingers. "Shining, burning, browning, cooling, falling, chilling. They could stay through the summer and fall seasons and leave at the end of the chilling?" "That would mean they'd be on their own for the winter," Wilmer pointed out. "That's right," said Ben. Are you suggesting we should keep them even longer? We'll be stretching ourselves to keep them all. They fell silent again, considering this. Finally, Mary spoke. Shall we let them stay for 6 months, then? She said, and teach them as much as we can. No one really liked this idea. They thought of the food the refugees would need, which would mean less for their own people, and the bother of teaching them all the skills they'd need to survive on their own. Each one, Mary, Wilmer, and especially Ben, wished the unfortunate cave people would simply vanish. But they weren't going to vanish, and the leaders of Sparks knew that they must, for the sake of their own conscience, do the right thing. They wanted to be wise, good leaders, unlike the leaders of the past, whose terrible mistakes had led to the disaster. So they'd be open-minded. They'd be generous. With this in mind, the 3 leaders voted. Mary voted yes, the cave people should stay. Ben voted yes, reluctantly, and Wilmer voted yes. So it was agreed. They would give them a place to stay. They would help them for 6 months. After that, the strangers would have to take care of themselves. Mary, Ben, and Wilmer shook hands on this agreement, but none of them said out loud what they were thinking. That even after 6 months, the people of Ember would be hard-pressed to start a town. The founders of Sparks had known carpentry and framing, and even so it had taken them 2 years just to build rough shelters to get the rocks out of the fields. They had known how to manage animals and build good soil, but still their animals sometimes died of disease and hunger in the many years when the crops failed. They had known to expect harsh weather, wolves and bandits, and still they suffered losses from all 3. The town leaders knew in their hearts that in this vast, empty country, where there were 1,000 dangers the people of Ember did not understand, they would never be able to take care of themselves. That's the end of the chapter.